Your table. I'm Jonathan Albin, and this is Nyko's RPG, and this is Game Master Soapbox. Today we're going to be talking about what price victory. What is it that drives players to want to succeed, and what lengths will they go to achieve it? Now, before we get started, of course, go down below and press all the buttons to let the algorithm know that you're part of our audience, and we'll get underway.
Absorbing damage is the name of the game. From the claws of monsters or the heat from a ball of flame. Our strength in numbers is a roll of the dice.
So, have you ever thought about what it is that goes into telling a story? Even if you're talking about a one-on-one situation and you're telling a personal story to your friends, what have you thought about what the outcome or the ramifications are? And what is it that makes that story compelling and puts the desire in your heart to share it? Now, the very concept of being a storyteller really elicits the idea of someone who has something to share and perhaps has a reason or multiple reasons for the sharing of that story. And we're going to be today talking about the very ethics of role-playing games and how the tenor and focus has changed over time, not only in the mechanisms of how to tell a story or how to play a game, but also in the very stories that are being told or shared. And there is a major change that has happened just in this last release of the Dungeons & Dragons 2025. And I'm not going to hit on it specifically, but I am going to talk about the very concept of what was considered to be the God rule in role-play games. And before we get too far into this, I want to clarify that concept is not stating that the storyteller becomes a god or attempts to be in the place of a god or anything of that nature. What I'm referring to is the very basic mechanism of, is there a story through line or is there not? And there are as many opinions on this as there are storytellers, and if you take the time to listen to me, perhaps you'll have a different perspective than you might have otherwise. But specifically, I want to talk here at the beginning about the very concept of the God rule. Now, to state the God rule very clearly and simply, it was always a early and singularly stated ruling that for the flow of the game and for the basic decency of the players at the table, that the decisions of the dungeon master would be final, and that their position was the last word on the subject. It was not to be debated or discussed or carried forward in any other way, simply for the sanity and the coherency of the game. Now, over time, the challenges of being a game master often became so difficult that the game master would relegate some of his responsibility to the players, or perhaps shirk some of them, specifically in the name of being a sandbox game master. But the concept of holding on to the God rule is not a statement of authority. It's not even intended to be a bullying mechanism or any of the other accusations that are thrown against it. Instead, it just simply resolves conflict the quickest. And ultimately, when you're having a good game and a fun time and something goes crooked, it's best to simply make a new change to a rule and hand wave and move on, rather than deal with it in the moment and drag it and make the entire play experience unfun. So as we go along, I think you'll see where I'm going to go with this, but the real idea here is that we are going to be talking fundamentally about the role of a game master and the storyteller and how they really suit the purpose for the game as which it was originally intended, and how far afield all of that has gone. So, in the original premise, the idea is that the story is of adventurers who have been either separated from their team or have discovered some place new that they want to investigate. They go basically on a form of spelunking, going into these ruins or this tomb or whatever, and discover not only horrible monsters and such that are protective of the place, but also the legends and the lore that might have represented how the place came to be. And early on, I'll admit, 11 years old, I'm not thinking, what Game Master would be thinking at that age, about the larger story and the deeper connotations of actions. And it was simply, knock on a door, kill a monster, take his loot. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that mechanism. It is a way to tell a story. And the benefit of such an open way to tell a story is that there's no judgment being made against the players. There's no penalty for utilizing the obvious violence intended in a role-playing system. It's very much like Monty Python. Now we see the violence inherent in the system. And we are to sort of do a hand-wavium of the effects of those magical elements of the game, simply so that we can get on to the next part of the story, if that's our intent. Or if we are simply knocking down doors and killing monsters, it's literally what's the new and most different monster you can put on the field, and how challenging is it going to be, and whether the players are going to survive. And this original premise just meant that the game master's rule, the one rule, the God rule, was simply to cut down on arguments. Just to, okay, we don't agree on that point, but we're just going to move on. And therefore there was less time to get frustrated, less time to be challenging to the game master. And it was literally just to enhance the fun of the game. There was no, as I said, there's no intention to put the heavy hand to the tiller, so to speak, but rather to take the person who is already making judgments and make his judgments the final ones. Now, as time went by, there were more and more properties that were published that were fundamentally stories that we had read in other books or tales that we had experienced in other ways that became emulative. We could play through the scenarios of the attack on Weathertop, or we could find ways to have competitions that were akin to the Knights of the Round Table jousting one another and such. And these emulation mechanisms allowed us to play through scenes that both ourselves and the players have already experienced. We already know what's coming, so to speak. And with that, there were more places to disagree with the game master about the rulings. The very concept of a person playing a role-playing game fundamentally meant that they not only had the player's handbook, but they more than likely had access to, if they didn't actually have a copy of, the monster manual and the DM's guide. And having these tools at their disposal meant that they were able to parse the rules as quickly and arguably more efficiently even than the game master. And the idea of the rules lawyer was devised. And this didn't preclude the game master's knowledge of the game, but it did actually pressure the game master to be able to support his arguments and defend his position. At the prime of my life, so to speak, when I was in my teens and early 20s, I knew the rules books, top and bottom, front to back, book, chapter, verse, page, paragraph, and side of the paragraph. There was a need for this game master any game master to be able to hold his own in the face of the litigators and game masters, and get past that and get back into the game, so to speak, as quickly as possible. So you were having to know the rules well enough that the story could then go on autopilot because you were just simply grinding through the rules mechanisms with your players. Furthermore, the game masters became less involved as they worked with properties that had well-established templates. The concept of the module rose in the early days of advanced D&D and the second edition, to the point where you literally could buy a new module every week and have 50 weeks a year of new game sessions, already chopped up into bite-sized morsels that you could literally spoon feed to your players. So there no longer was the need for the game master to be as creative. Now, I would argue that it actually opened up room for more creativity because the game master could vary off of themes and draw material from multiple modules to make the game more dynamic. But what it came down to for the players, of course, was that they had now the access to the modules and to the way game mechanics were operated so that they could build on an emulative or unimaginative and copy-paste means of gaining the information for an adventure. So they could cast it as their own, but by changing out the names and the places, they could make the innovation seem more imaginative, which therefore foiled the players who were also reading the same data, but provided the game master with a way to hold some one-upmanship, but it wasn't requiring them to be ultimately creative. They could just simply copy and paste and turn to the page and read the information to the players. And it took away from their agency and their malleability. And as we moved into the beginnings of the D20 era and what was later known as the D20 glut, the open license was fundamentally an open season. You could now rip and read, so to speak, modules on the fly. We weren't yet to the massive printable capabilities, but we were getting there. And I know that many of the game stores that I was involved with, even at that point in my life, had copy machines inside the store because they knew that players were going to be duplicating material directly from modules and from books. Now, that seems a little harsh, but it was also a situation of economic expediency for players who were on the lower end of the economic spectrum, and also a means for the more sophisticated adventurers to have full color maps to work with and things like that hadn't been possible in earlier ages. And these open licenses really opened the door on there being products that were stripped from other genres, other titles, and basically pumped out into the game space. And the game masters were therefore now no longer having to actually create anything. If they were clever enough, they could pull resources from 100 different places, and their adventures would be just as rich and just as effective. And those of us that were on the creative side tended to try to drive ourselves away from that material. And so for a lot of time throughout the late 1990s and early 2000s and on into the next century, we were actually looking at keeping our properties away from the others, and therefore even terms that are now commonplace were totally alien to the games groups I was working with. As a matter of fact, the first time I heard the term murder hobo was after I was actually working for Gamma, because it was only then that I got to put my nose back into the printed materials, because I'd been running my homebrew, my personal stuff for so long that really was no longer a necessity to see what was going on in the marketplace. So I was kind of caught off guard with many of the themes that were starting to come into place in this period. With the end of the glut, when the D&D rules set was changing from the 2.0, the AD&D 2.0 mechanism, to the 3.0 and the new Wizards of the Coast interpretation of Dungeons and Dragons, there were clearance aisles at game stores for a period of time. These were decent quality modules, but they were written for that earlier mechanism, the D&D rule system. And so as a game master who is still operating within that earlier framework and I hadn't moved over into 3.0, suddenly I had an open game on new modules to churn through and gather pieces from. And even those game masters who were operating in the 3.0 were also looking for resources, because with the cutoff, the break in the glut, so to speak, the game masters found that they really didn't have a lot of new material coming to them quick enough, and so they were grinding through and charring through that same cookie cutter older material for new innovations. And this whole process was actually undermining the game master process, because the players were getting information now fed to them through the player support materials, giving the players a greater agency on what they wanted to do within the game, and actually beating down the game master's level of obligation to the game. It wasn't to the point yet of saying there wasn't a value to game masters, and there wasn't yet a push to cause the game masters to back off and get out of the way. But that was looming, and by the time we get to 3.5, it has hit in full swing, and even our games group was sort of driven backwards into the arms of Dungeons and Dragons 2.0. The second edition had become the new first edition for us, therefore, and therefore we started play groups again, stepping backwards away from 3.0 simply because of its sophistication and its drive to make the players more powerful. And that sounds like hubris. I've got several players that have responded to me saying that I'm maybe old-fashioned, and I'll be honest with you, I sort of am. But the idea that the players were able to create for themselves the story of their characters without regard to what the game master had for them or was planning for them or providing them with, really undermined the connective way in which Dungeons & Dragons had evolved to that point. And if you go back and look at that period of time, there was a considerable drop-off in sales in Dungeons & Dragons as the new Wizards version came out. But that was eventually overcome simply because the appeal of the game was still as solid as ever, and now the players had the opportunity to basically purchase the books and pursue the storytelling elements just in building the backstory, just in building the preface of their character. Therefore, they didn't even have to have a game master in most cases. And to this point, many people have been commenting in my comment sections that the role of a game master is becoming more archaic, and I don't agree with that. I push back on that only because of the appeal that my game sessions seem to have, and the number of times that I've filled up to overflow the number of people I have at a table, and have had to expand and increase the number of games that I run simply to appeal to placate and appeal all the people that would like to play. Then along comes the increase in video. I don't know enough about the technology to say when it was particularly, but there was a point where the video quality of games became more movie-like, and they are getting more so every day. And this video marketplace is blotting out creativity, because not only is it giving you stories with characters that have to fit that story element, there are, their mechanics define who you're going to play. And then, of course, there's the pressure to look to other sources on the internet to optimize your build. And all of these lead to a reduction in individual creativity, other than possibly the very structure of a persona's face. For the most part, all of the mechanics of the game drive you towards the ends that will support a quote successful run through of whatever the game mechanic is. And this blots out individual creativity. There's not even a way to emulate in many cases the individuality you might be able to in a tabletop game. And because of this, therefore, the number of people that are coming backwards into role play from the video games marketplace are finding themselves somewhat disappointed because there's not a way to build their optimal builds, because role playing requires too many thoughts, too many options to be a one-to-one comparison with their much more narrow role play perception coming from the video marketplace. Now, these changes really have to do with the amount of work that a game master puts into the game. If the game master's resources are easy and plentiful and simplified, that's what their games will be, is easy, simple, and made more simple to be a part of. And the argument is that you get more people to play that way, right? Well, not really, because when a game is oversimplified or under expanded, then the players feel that frustration with the fact that the game isn't allowing them to do what physically they might be able to do. And the very concept of the improvisational humor aspect of yes and goes out the window. You're not pursuing the what if of the situation. Instead, you're looking at the what should be, what the game mechanics will allow. And that causes two different aspects. One is it's going to cause a division between the game masters and the players from themselves, because a good game master might appeal to those people who are sophisticated and want a lot of options, whereas the more simple game master is going to draw down those people who don't care about that so much, but they just want the action to continue. And therefore now you're dividing your marketplace into the emulative, innovative, imaginative folks are going one direction, and the quick play, easy rules, flat dynamics are going to go in the other. And so you end up with this bifurcation, and therefore the number of quality game masters starts to dwindle, only because there are not as many players looking for that kind of quality game, just as there are more game masters that are producing what might be argued to be shoddy adventuring, but they are able to find more players because there are more people who are willing to accept less quality adventures simply to keep playing. Now, I do realize that in every one of these points, I'm drawing lines, and there may be people that fall into the other category. But speaking as a game master with 50 years behind the screen, my experience is that a quality game master with a great level of a story is going to draw quality players who want that rich story, and they work out fine. I very rarely have a session where I have people either not show up or choose to do something else rather than play. But here's where the problem comes. When your players' attention suffers, the players don't stay. I have dozens of game masters I've talked to over the years who run a good, tight game session, but perhaps they shortcut their combat a little bit, or they shortcut the drama, or they play down the role play of the game and want to get right to the combat. All of these different microcosms can cause the players to suffer. Partially, the players have a much lower attention span and want to get through the scenes quicker, but they also tend to want the story to draw to them, and so they are looking for those crunchy bits, so to speak, that will keep them interested. And so either way, your game will suffer when your story quality descends, and when you're no longer providing the kind of material quality that the players are looking for, they will look elsewhere. Now, I said all of that to say this, so to speak. When we talk about role play and conflict, the mechanics almost always come down to the physical engagement between players and monsters, or players and the villains. And when these are no longer cerebral, thought-through processes, but simply roll dice, wait for a resolution, roll dice, wait for a resolution, the situation now is more competitive. You're only looking at damage produced, or DPM, one of the terms, or how much you can tank the damage. And all of these terms are coming from the video games marketplace, who look at combat completely differently and instead look at it more of a mechanism than an actual storytelling tool. And because it's not cerebral, it's not thought out or intellectually engaging, the players find themselves dissatisfied. And when they're dissatisfied, they simply don't show up. And those who are into that level of competitiveness tend to also gravitate towards the miniatures-based games, or rulers and role play kind of situation, where you're rolling the bunches and bunches of dice to determine success or failure, and not really thinking about the connotations of the battle, but merely whether there's a success or a failure on every dice roll. And all of this tends to downplay or undermine the very storytelling mechanism that requires a hard hand. The game, if it's running itself, you don't need a game master to adjudicate. You simply have to have a rules lawyer standing by to make sure everything is done fairly. This brings us all back around to the concept that I started with, and that is the idea of the God mode rule, the one rule that says that the game master is always right. And that's actually a misinterpretation. The idea is that the game master's decision should be final. He should be fair. He should listen to everybody's opinion about such and then make an adjudication. It's just that once the adjudication is done, that should be the end of the conflict, so that we can get on to the fun part of the game. But I'm going to ask you to take part in a challenge. It's called a Theater of the Mind challenge. If your games have been played with miniatures and with multitudes of die rolls and a lot of cross-referencing of combat sheets and such, I'm going to ask you to do something rather rebellious. I'm going to suggest that you play at least one game session in the Theater of the Mind. Theater of the Mind. In other words, to actually forego the use of the rolling mechanism. Instead, play through the story narratively. Have the descriptions provided by the game master, and you respond with your perception of what's going on in the game so that he can interact with it. Do this for 3 sessions. If by the end of the 3rd session you have not seen a part of what I'm talking about, I would be glad to hear your response and commentary. But the reality is that a game session that's played outside of the Theater of the Mind, when you're playing with miniatures and playing pieces and the like, what you're doing is you're setting yourself up to be railroaded into a perception that isn't yours. You're going to be looking at the fight scene, so to speak, not through your own lens, but through some game's mechanic that's going to alter and change the way you think about what your actions might be. So my challenge is for you to try that for 3 weeks and let me know. Come back and leave a comment. I'd love to hear how your response goes. In the meantime, I need to get out of here. I've been speaking for about a half an hour. This is Jonathan Albin, and this is Game Master Soapbox, and we've been talking about the God Mode rule. The clarification is that the current God Mode rule has been revised to state that the players should communicate together and then come to a decision that is mutually acceptable to everyone there. The irony is that is exactly what the original rule stated, except put it through the filter of an adjudicator, a single person who can make those decisions. Love to hear your opinion. We may not agree, but we will see. I want to thank you for being here, and don't forget we're here Monday through Friday, generally at 11-ish to p.m. or 10 a.m., all in Pacific times, and I will see you next episode. Remember,